Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session, Tackling the Stigma, a conversation around the role of sport in mental health.
My name is Marley Blackney-Noda and I'm from Southwest Sport. Southwest Sport is a regional sports assembly covering the Southwest region in Victoria. We are here to support volunteers, develop clubs and strengthen the community sports sector. Firstly, I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. We pay our respects to the local people for allowing us to have our gathering on their land and to their elders, past, present and future. We associate participation in sport and recreation as having a number of physical benefits, but what we tend to forget is the mental health benefits. We are starting to see more and more elite athletes be more open and transparent around their experience with mental health during their careers, but what we are not seeing is that being translated into community sport. There seems to be a stigma around mental health and an unwillingness to share with our teammates and coaches.
Today we are joined by a panel of local experts who are willing to share their thoughts on the subject. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr Jodie Fleming. Jodie is a clinical and health psychologist with almost 15 years of experience. In 2010, Jodie returned to Warrnambool to work as a clinical psychologist within a multidisciplinary team at the Glenrye Centre and as a health psychologist with the Health Service Centre, both at St John of God Healthcare, and set up her private practice in 2011. In 2018, Jodie expanded her private practice, the psychology of it, and endeavours to integrate activity into her sessions, offering her clients the opportunity to walk and talk, practice mindful eating in restaurants, and even engage in relaxation therapies while stand-up paddleboarding. Jodie also began working as the school psychologist at Emmanuel College in 2018 and made this her main job in 2020. Jodie is also the author of A Hole in My Genes, a memoir about her own experiences with breast cancer. Our next panellist I'd like to introduce is Linda Holland. When Linda joined Lifeline's 13, 11, 14 service as a telephone crisis supporter in 2011, her diverse background served her well. She has managed a community legal centre, a social housing program, a consumer affairs advocacy service, and Centrelink's personal support program for people experiencing extreme difficulties in their lives. She founded a psychosocial program for the Southwest Healthcare Hospital Admission Risk Program in Warrnambool and spent many years delivering parenting and emotional intelligence training, working with Indigenous community and parents with disabilities. Linda's latest incarnation is a LLD Suicide Prevention Service Coordinator covering the Great South Coast of Victoria based in Warrnambool, a position that draws on her passion for delivering suicide prevention training. Linda also coordinates her local support following suicide program alongside J Suite Social Services and Victoria Police. And finally, I'd like to introduce John Parkinson. John began his career at Briley Psychiatric Hospital in 1974, where basic custodial care was accepted practice. Since then, John has experienced huge changes in the delivery of treatment and care since the integration of mainstream services and community-based models of care began in the early 1990s. John, in his words, has been to the University of Life, having listened and learnt from hundreds of people's stories in regards to their struggles with mental illness as a credentialed mental health nurse. John spent 13 years developing a mental health service at St John of God Warrnambool Hospital as the Community Relations Mental Health Manager in line with the mission and values of St John of God Healthcare. John is now the Family and Parents with a Mental Illness Coordinator at Southwest Mental Health Services. John is the co-founder of Let's Talk Foundation. Let's Talk Foundation was created in 2016 after a shocking increase in suicide rates in our community. Their aim is to abolish the stigma associated with mental illness, increase help seeking when required, increase the confidence of all to ask questions and be more supportive of those in our community that do struggle from time to time, and empower all communities to take better care of themselves, reducing the prevalence of mental illness. I would really like to thank Jodie, Linda and John for giving up their time and joining us today to talk about a really important subject that needs to be shown more light in our community. What do you think the impact is on a person's mental health who participates in sport and or recreation activities?
I think the impact is largely a positive one, mostly because when we think about the most effective coping mechanisms that we have for our mental health, for building a strong foundation for good mental health, social support is right up there. And in many sporting clubs, it pretty well comes with a built-in social network. So that's a real protective factor. And of course, when we think about physical activity, as standalone, we often talk about exercise as being the most effective antidepressant that there is for our brain, and a much more powerful one than, anything we could buy from a pharmacy. And so in terms of that, you get the double whammy. So that has a really positive impact on our mental health and well-being as well. And I think, generally speaking, athletes are very good at taking care of their diet, their sleep, their physical health, which obviously is also a protective factor for their mental health. And whilst there are a few, I think, aspects to being an athlete that potentially lend themselves to be or I don't want to say risk factors, but have a negative impact on mental health, including, some performance anxiety and some, for example, some setting really high standards for themselves, putting pressure on to perform a certain way. There are some things that may go against our mental health and well-being, but largely I think sporting clubs are set up to handle mental health and create good mental health really well.
John or Linda, do you have anything to add from your experience to that question?
I think Jodie probably said most of what I was thinking about, but just touching on what you concluded on, Jodie, I think is really relevant now. There's so much emphasis on success and winning. What's got lost in all of that is actually what you touched on, is the social community, the connection to each other, and to sacrifice in a team sport, to play as a team, not as an individual. But as I said, there is so much emphasis now on success that I worry about the stress that brings on, right across the whole, the club, if you like, because teams that aren't successful struggle because the finances have to coexist, and there's so much emphasis now on money. And look at the AFL. In the last 24 hours, they've now released a round. There must have been so much pressure on that because finances are such a huge part of any sport. And the elite athletes, I don't say it probably coexists where they put themselves under just as much pressure as what the external forces are. So unfortunately, it's no longer purely about participation and playing for the jumper or the club. It's about success.
Yeah, great. Linda, did you have anything?
Marley, I was just going to mention around, the impact on people's mental health playing sports, whether it's for competition or for recreational. It just it builds confidence for people who are participating. As Jodie said, it improves all those things like sleep and things like that. It builds leadership skills as well in people, whether that's in a recreational, whether you're a mentor to another player or in a club situation. And I think that just those overwhelming health benefits, whether you're playing for recreation, social or sport, as a whole, I mean, everything's got its ups and downs, but I think for mental health, sport, whether it's for professional or personal, is just a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, great. I think what you guys have mentioned around obviously competitive sport leads into this next question really well, actually, which is, do you think there's a difference in mental health issues in people who participate in competitive sport versus those who participate in recreational social sport?
Yeah, I just pushed the unmute button because I thought it probably leads into what the statements I made earlier. And we can see, there is so much publicity now about elite athletes and sportsmen that are experiencing mental health issues and mental illness. I suppose I'm a big fan of football because I played football myself for many years, certainly not at the elite level. But I think it's a double-edged sword as well, because we have people stepping out now and acknowledging that they've got mental health problems, which maybe that's a lead into other people being willing to step forward and acknowledge that they're not coping with it. So I suppose there's, as I said, it's about success, but sometimes success comes at a cost. And, elite sportsmen, it's not forever. So I then start to think about, well, how do they transition out of that elite sport into, everyday civilian life when they don't have all the attention? And I'm sure, I've talked to a few AFL players and that, and they like it. They love the publicity. They love the spotlight. And they have difficulty sometimes when they come out of that because the spotlight's no longer on them, and they just go back to, being the average Joe Blow walking down the street. So whereas the social side for non-elite sports people, I think is absolutely wonderful. We were born to exercise. I'm very big on evolution. Wasn't all that long ago when we didn't have cars or even horses for that matter. And we walked everywhere. We ran everywhere. Well, if you think the impact and how much technology accelerated in the last 30 odd years and that, I think that's why we have such an obesity problem now in this country, because we're just not doing what our body needs, and that's exercising every day.
Yeah, great. I know, Jodie, you, I think, have worked with our counterpart, which is the Southwest Sports Academy. Have you seen anything, because obviously they're kids that are trying to make it into the elite?
I think we have to be careful to not jump to conclusions that just because some elite athletes are now coming out and speaking about their mental health or mental illnesses, that we jump to a conclusion that means it happens more in elite athletes. I think at the end of the day, the unique pressures that come with being a unique athlete for sure may form a risk factor for them going on to develop a mental illness or having mental health issues. But it's just one risk factor. And usually with most mental illnesses, we have a multitude of risk factors that have all aligned in order to then evolve into an actual mental illness. And I've worked with, Southwest Academy of Sport athletes, also our high performance training program at Emmanuel, but also athletes who just love performing in recreational sport. And for me, it more comes down to an individual sort of personality, not a type, but factors that contribute to the likelihood that they are able to have balance outside of their sport, who are able, those who are quite perfectionistic and set very unrelenting standards for themselves often end up with worse outcomes because nobody's perfect, and we're not always able to achieve those very high standards that we might set for ourselves. Some people are predisposed to focus on what went wrong and not be able to shift that attention and focus on what's actually happening in a game. Some pin their entire identity to a performance or to that role as an athlete, and that can be great, but it also can be quite detrimental to their mental health. So I think, actually it can also be more of an individual kind of situation rather than it being because you're an elite athlete or because you're, not. So, and, in another lifetime, I did some work as a myotherapist at the AIS, and it's just even interesting to compare, athletes who are participating in team sports versus individual sports. And especially those individual sports, they have to become quite centered. That's not the right way to say it, but that they have to be self-focused in order to succeed. And so their ability to look at the big picture might get a bit blurred. And I could go on forever. There's so many factors that could, contribute and make it, a positive or a negative or neutral. So I don't know if I answered your question. I hope so.
No, I think you definitely did. I don't know, Linda, did you?
Only really to probably support something Jodie said. I had a bit of a think about it and thought, in some cases, that team environment of competitive sports can bring about that real camaraderie and that sense of fun and support. And an individual athlete can be more isolated and alone. But Jodie touched on the identity, and I think whether that comes into the next question as well, there can be a real problem when someone hangs their identity on their achievement, and that can often set people up, for an injury that may occur. They can often feel that their whole sense of identity has been lost. So I guess that's a risk factor as well, but that can go across the board in individual sports and professional and individual.
Yeah, great. I do have a question, a couple of questions in the future, sort of around the athlete first, or the athlete second, human first. But firstly, my next question, often we do think of professional athletes and community sport participants differently, but at the end of the day, as you guys said, we're all human beings. Why do you think mental health is not discussed as openly at a community sport level?
Yeah. Now, how many hours do you want with this one? Well, clearly, obviously, why it's not discussed, I suppose, because historically it has been seen as taboo. We don't talk about mental illness. It wasn't all that long ago when it was institutional care and institutional care only. Locally it was Brolly Hospital, and no relative talked about, their family member being out of Brolly Hospital. It just wasn't discussed about because it's never been accepted the same way as a physical illness has been. But I think we are slowly advancing, very, very slowly. The decommissioning of the institutions back in '93, in some respects, I was a part of that, and maybe we threw the baby out with the bathwater, the way it was done. However, we done the best we could with what we had at that particular point in time. And and there's been huge advancements in the treatment of mental injury, as I'm calling it now, not necessarily illness. The introduction of psychology as an art form, as a treatment, was never ever thought about up until, in recent years down in this area anyway. It's always been medication, and that's not always indicated. So, as I said, I could rattle on for ages about this one, but I think I'm always one to look on the positive side of things, and that's why I'm saying we've made huge advances in recent year to break down the stigma so people are more open to talk about it. And I guess that's why I touched on it before about elite sportsmen. When they do go in the media and they do acknowledge that they've suffered depression, whether it's, Wayne Swass and Pucker Up or Simon Hogan, I think they're wonderful because people do admire those sorts of individuals within our community. So that's why I said earlier, well, if they can talk about it, maybe that's a platform where I can start to talk about it too. And that's where, I think Let's Talk has made huge developments, because people that have been seen as upstanding, hardworking citizens, they haven't been untouchable. They have been touched by ill health. So the more we can actually, I'm going to use the word normalise it, because I guess one would say, well, it's not a normal response to experience depression, anxiety, but it's so damn prevalent now because of the elements of society that we live in. It is becoming more and more common. But the more we talk about it, the more I think that's such a therapeutic treatment option, purely just to talk.
I was listening to what you said, John, and I think that the stigma, unfortunately, that has surrounded mental health or mental illness, and unfortunately has been historically seen as something not to talk about and almost a weakness rather than a step of courage. And when you are addressing something that historically has been looked upon as a weakness, from a perspective, we always want to look on the strengths and the positives, and so therefore maybe sporting clubs, as a lot of other parts of our community have done, sadly have pushed it, not spoken about it, didn't want to appear weak, when in actual fact now we're seeing people taking steps of real courage and stepping out and saying, hey, I'm not doing so well. And people are recognising that, as we said, we're all human, and it's important that we all admit to that.
I love the word normalised, because depending on what research you read, like on average, 1 in 2 of us are going to have an episode of a mental illness at some stage in our lifetime. 1 in 4 of us are going to have an episode of significant anxiety, and not just normal human anxiety, an anxiety disorder kind of anxiety. So it is really normal, and it's a part of the human experience. And I think people in general do not do well with what they don't understand, and they don't do well with feeling vulnerable. And when they see the worst cases of depression or anxiety or mental illness, psychotic disorders, whatever it might be, portrayed in the media, they jump to a conclusion that could happen to them, and that's too confronting. That makes them feel very vulnerable, and so they would rather shut that out than actually accept that as a part of the human condition in a way. And we are really lucky that we're starting to break down stigma, and we are really lucky that some really brave people with some voices louder than ours are starting to speak up and normalise that. Because if it can happen to your favourite football player or sportsman or sports person, then that might mean that what I'm going through is normal too, and that there are things that we can do about that. And we understand so much more about our brain, about our the whole person now, to understand what goes wrong, and then therefore the things that can be put in place to remedy that. Like, normal.
Yeah, great. As you guys touched on before, especially you, John, our focus is so heavy on the competition and the winning, and that's what it's all about. But now these days, and hopefully normalising talking about how you're feeling and stuff, and pushing, that human first, athlete second in sports clubs. Can you just explain why sports clubs should do that and why it's so important?
I was thinking as you were talking then, Marley, and I was thinking about when you lose, when you're not successful. That's part of life. Suffering is part of life. So when you lose, you have to be able to deal with it. When something doesn't go your way, you have to be able to deal with it. And whether that's by talking to somebody, talking to your teammates or something like that. We used to go after a game, if we lost, we'd still go and have a beer with the winning team. And what happened on the ground stayed on the ground. But it's become so much more complex now. The sport itself, it's analysed to the nth degree. And in some respects, I look at the endless discussions that go on about a game of footy, which really is 36 blokes running around a paddock chasing a pigskin. But it is made into something that I sometimes worry, is that real or is it not? But there's so many other layers to it that, I'm certainly not going to touch on now. But I feel that, it is about participation, but it's also about accepting that you cannot be a winner on every single occasion. And it builds resilience, it builds character into yourself. And I think that also leads to a level of self-respect, which then in turn leads to respect from others. When you don't have a temper tantrum, or you don't become an absolute serial killer and go out and murder everybody because you've lost a game of footy or sport or, whatever it might be.
I think just on what you were saying, we always hear that, in recent times, how sport has changed in terms of every kid gets a participation certificate, every kid gets, a medal, and how I know even for me, who's 28, back in the day, like there was a winning team and there was a losing team, and you know, mum and dad would be like, okay, well, it's okay, you lost this one, but maybe next time. And do you think that there's been a shift in society, and I suppose the comments around kids these days, I guess, being coddled a little bit more is the reason that that stigma has been put in place, that, you know, maybe it's not okay to talk about those kind of things, because I mean, it does get brought up.
I think I think there's been a shift too far in that direction, and I think sport provides the perfect opportunities for so many of life's lessons, like Linda was referring to before. Resilience is built on the sporting field, or you know, and we need to have winners and losers, but I think we also need balance. Sport is something that we do. It's our job, if in some instances, yeah, but it's not our entire person. And I think so many people get tricked into, this is just generally speaking, thinking that they are their thoughts and beliefs, that they are what they do, that they are their emotions. But that's so not true. That's just a piece of the package that makes us who we are. And I think it could be said quite generally that anyone that puts too much emphasis on one specific area of their life and doesn't have balance sets themselves up for problems. And whether that's because your career is going to end when you're 35 and now what? I haven't actually prepared for anything else. Or whether that's that you tie your entire identity up into winning or losing, you're setting yourself up for a big fall, I think. So having balance across who you are you as a friend, who are you as a worker, who are you as an athlete, who are you as a family person, who are you as a stranger walking down the street who sees someone who falls over. Like, none of that has anything to do with you being an athlete, although you might have learnt and developed a lot of your own personality traits and a lot of your own values on the sporting field. Fantastic. Yeah, please save me, Linda.
No, I'm nodding away, Jodie. They're the same thoughts that I had as well. That, you know, we often people often tie themselves to their identity, their job title, who they are, what I do, rather than who I am. And everything you've said, I agree with, that we can set ourselves up to be real trouble if we've tied ourselves to an identity that is just a one-dimensional identity. And that's where I think sports can go, as you say, into such a great way of teaching kids leadership and resilience, and how to fall down and how to get up, how to fall down and ask for help to get up, and all those sorts of life skills. That it's a dangerous thing to not put the human first. To put the athlete first is kind of setting the athlete up for a fall that they may can't get back up from.
Can I just finish on that question? I spent some time with Wayne Swath, and he summed it up really well, I thought. He knew how to play footy, no worries at all. But his only toolbox that he had in how to manage life was alcohol and marijuana. It's
interesting, isn't it? Often for smaller regional communities, which is where we live, the local football netball club, for example, is the hub of the community. What do you think the impact of COVID-19 isolation has had on those participants and their communities?
Well, I think the social distancing and the inability to see each other regularly, to train, or to see each other as a group at all, could possibly have had, quite detrimental effects. I know just with the young people that I work with, I'm encouraging them to be, FaceTiming and to going out, for a walk one-on-one and catching up that way, but it just doesn't cut the mustard in a lot of cases. So I think that that alone has had a really big impact on a lot of people's well-being. I had a friend of mine who's not an athlete, but rang tonight going into her 11th week of working from home, and she lives alone and she's not coping at all. I think as human beings, largely, we are designed to be socially connected. And so when we remove that, it actually removes one of the most effective coping mechanisms we have. And so we've seen, just because of that change, everybody's cortisol stress levels have increased globally, and people are going, why am I not sleeping as well? Why am I feeling more stressed? I'm not worried about anything, but just because of all of that change. And so we'd be silly to think that sporting teams where they've had, one massive part of their usual, and not to mention their physical activity reduced, when that's been removed, of course, it makes sense that they may experience sort of a downfall in their mental well-being.
And also from a perspective of community, as you said, Marley, sporting clubs in rural and regional areas are the hub. And, the isolation that the athletes themselves experienced, I started thinking about, the ladies and the men who run the canteen and take the money at the gates, and the volunteers, the spectators, the grandparents. All those people have had almost something that's just dissolved in front of their eyes. Their reason for kind of, some people, that football on a Saturday or netball or tennis or whatever it may have been the linchpin of their social lives. So that's that real disconnection that communities were feeling across the board has had a huge impact on that sense of fear for the future. So I'd say it's had as we say, a worldwide effect on people.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the thing when we speak of sports clubs that sometimes we forget about. It's not just about the people participating. There is so many people in the background that you rely on that social connection of the sports club, and I guess we need to remember that it's not just about the athlete who gets out on the field and competes every weekend and then goes to training. There is that. I was speaking to a sports club, a smaller rural sports football netball club, who their main concern was their community. Their community's made up of dairy farmers, and the one thing that they look forward to every week is Thursday night dinners at the footy club, watches the team train, comes for dinner, and that's sort of where they come together. And COVID-19 and this pandemic has really put a stop to that. And I guess their main concern was how those members of the community were doing.
Marley, can I
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to make a comment about, COVID-19 has, what you guys just spoken about. But if you wind the clock back, 10 or 15 years, so many smaller football clubs and sporting clubs have closed because they're not financially sustainable, like Haywood, MacArthur. And equally, they were the centre of the community. And unfortunately, they've just got swallowed up because of the cost factor. The one probably I'd say, Noorat Footy, Kallura Noorat, I think they do 250 meals of a Thursday night. It's absolutely, it's going off down there every Thursday night, but like a lot of other clubs. So I think COVID-19 is just, in my mind, reaffirmed what other smaller communities have gone through a number of years ago, purely because it just wasn't financially sustainable for them to keep going.
Yeah.
And on another point before we leave that question, Marley, the other side, the flip side of this as well, if we try to pull a positive out, has been that through adversity, people become very creative. And some of the things we have seen clubs, communities, organisations do to try to find new ways of connecting have been unbelievable. So it has had negative effect, but I think we've seen some really creative, positive effects as well, which shows the human spirit in its purest form, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That actually ties in really well with my next question, which is, what can clubs do to check in and remain present in those communities? As you said, we've seen a lot of sports clubs go online, and I know a few local clubs have been doing like Instagram TV videos with their members, YouTube. They've been getting on YouTube and doing, you know, workout sessions that their members can connect with. But is there anything else that you think clubs can do? Obviously, now we're seeing things reopening and clubs being able to do minimal stuff, but is there anything else that you think clubs can do to check in and remain present with their members and those in the community?
I did have a few notes just around things like you've just spoken about, really, you know, the online sort of sports and some e-newsletters and all that sort of thing. But I thought today, and this may relate to this question or another one, one of the things that I don't know if clubs do, but I think that it might be something to think about to really connect, whether we're still in a partial lockdown or not, is I'm wondering whether clubs, you know how Glenelg Shire and Warrnambool City Council and all our types of, all our local governments have a youth council. And I wondered today, do clubs actually have youth committees? You know, you've got the big committee that sits up and meets on Thursday nights or whatever, but I'm wondering about engaging the younger, like a sustainable, hear the voices of the young ones and give them some permission to make some decisions and bring in new ideas. Whether it fits with this question or not, Marley, I don't know, but I think that might be something for clubs to really consider, to kind of get a youth committee going.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a great idea for clubs. I know a few clubs that I've spoken to have voiced their concerns around, obviously their junior members are asking questions around when can we start back, why isn't training happening, when are we allowed to play next, and their concerns are how do we answer those questions to our younger members, like, you know, our Auskick kids or our under 12s, and that might be a really good way to do that, and because I know sometimes conversations from like the older kids is a lot better received by the younger kids because they're the big kids and they look up to them. And yeah, I think
it gives them a voice, Marley, and it gives them a bit of buy-in, which I feel would sustain the clubs in the future and build that real sense of community. That every, you know, you're a member of our club, you have a voice. You don't have to always be told what's going to happen. We'll ask you for your ideas, because sometimes maybe they've got the answers, just haven't got the voices.
Yeah,
great idea.
Did anybody else have?
I don't know about you guys, but I've been most touched by just the one-on-one check-ins, like from people that you might not even expect to check in with you, like outside your normal friends and family. And so I wonder if a real nice one-on-one contact from a coach, for example, to each individual athlete, just that little reach out and check in, that could go a really long way. And you might be more likely to hear from somebody if they are having a few struggles in a more private conversation than you might in a team sort of setting or online, you know, how's everyone going kind of thing.
Great, Jodie.
Yeah, definitely. I know, especially for those winter codes, your football, your netball, your basketball, that kind of thing, hockey, all of their teams were sort of ready to start just before, obviously, isolation kicked in. So, yeah, there is that coach-player relationship. So I think that's a great idea, just checking in one-on-one. John, did you have any comments for how clubs might check in?
No, I think they've been pretty much doing it all the way through, actually, Marley. I think in some ways maybe I'm a bit old and a bit conservative. You know, I think probably through my eyes, and I guess it's totally different when you look through an adolescent's eyes, where their brain hasn't fully developed, so they're maybe a little bit more about, you know, impatient and intolerance and I want to play, why can't I play, blah, blah, blah. Whereas I look at, well, if you look at the sacrifice that's been made in southwest Victoria in the last few months, I think that's totally negligible to what our forefathers have actually sacrificed. So I think in some respects it'd be good for young people to hear the stories of the older people on actually what they went through, and maybe it might put it in perspective. But that's an old bloke talking.
No, definitely. I agree with that. I agree. So obviously we all know the physical benefits of participating in sport, good health and all that kind of stuff. I know we've touched on it a little bit, but probably just in a little bit more detail, what those social and emotional benefits are of sport and recreation.
So, our primal brain is programmed for us to have a sense of belonging to community. We needed that for our very survival. I'm always talking about the cavemen and, that we needed the hunter-gatherer and we needed the fire starter and we needed the person to look over the village to make sure there were no threats coming, and we needed the person to look after the kids and so on. And unless we had all of the members of the community didn't survive. So our brains haven't evolved much from there, and we still have a very primal need to connect and have a greater sense of belonging to a group larger than ourselves. So that just needs to be fulfilled. That's a part of the human condition. And, from a brain perspective, exercise has a positive impact on every single system in our body, and not least of all for the production of, neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, which are all about our reward system, our pleasure system, and those that keep our energy levels high and our concentration sharp and keep our brain functioning really well. When we struggle with things like stress and anxiety, and our adrenaline sort of running the show and our cortisol's running the show, like it sort of absorbs, our the dopamine that we have available, and sort of we're busy putting the fire extinguisher on those guys, and so our emotion center's running the show. Whereas something like exercise and physical activity and even just that social connection, because that's producing all of our beautiful oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin as well, it just sets up a really healthy cycle for well-being. And so I don't know if you wanted it in that much depth, but essentially, social and emotional health is the cornerstone of our mental health and well-being. So sport ticks a lot of boxes there. And like anything though, like we need balance. And so when we have anything in an extreme situation, there's then imbalance, and that's when we set ourselves up with risk of having mental illness or mental health issues. So we don't want too much focus on one thing, but we need a nice balance there.
During the week, I was reading a report from one of the universities in America, and I don't know which one, but it was really interesting around the social and well-being and emotional benefits that go beyond the scope. Things like reduces crime. When people are connected to sporting clubs at their schools, they noticed a reduction in crime in the city. In fact, a considerable reduction in crime. They noticed that some of the kids were attending school more often than wagging and taking days off. So that sort of real social benefits that we may not think of, that sort of go out into our streets, which I think it's quite advantageous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
My only thought, Marley, was that, in the development of personality, some is genetic, parents and that, but I think sport is a major influence on our own development as we go through. We've touched on winning and losing. Every experience we have with another human being, it may well leave a small part. It shapes us who we are. So the more we integrate with other people and we choose qualities that we like about them, and then we maybe throw out other qualities in other people that we don't like about them, but through that whole process, we develop ourselves. So I think that's where sport can be very, very rewarding in developing and shaping who you are as an individual. And I think it certainly taught me that I'm an individual. It's not about following the crowd or peer group pressure. Eventually, you do develop a filter and you sift through what suits you, and you keep that, and you throw away the stuff that doesn't.
Yeah, great. This next question was given to me actually, and I thought it was very interesting. Is mental health the same as happiness, or is it just the absence of mental illness? It was an interesting doozy of a question. I thought I'd throw it out there and see what answer I got back.
We're all handing it to Jodie.
Oh, God. Mental health is not happiness, I would say. Happiness is an emotion that is designed to not last that long, in actual fact. So there's a therapy called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy Act that's all about, if our goal is to be happy, then, God help you, because we're just not designed to be happy all the time. So it's certainly not that. I don't know. I think I'd like to view mental health in terms of functioning, how we function in all areas of our life, socially, occupationally, academically, in our daily activities. And mental illness, I don't see mental health and mental illness as either end of a spectrum either. Just the same way, well, I don't know, I suppose some people do weigh up, our physical health and disease as being either end of a spectrum. But, well, I don't know. I think I'm digging myself a hole. Save me, someone.
No, you're not digging yourself a hole, because I think it's a very, very individualised and complex question. I've always sort of summed it up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs of self-actualisation. Being able to rise to the challenges that life throws out to you, feeling good about yourself, that you do have a place, that you do have a level of self-respect and in turn respect from others. There's a show on telly, I was up at Middle Bogensville, and he summed it up perfectly. He only had 3 things important in life: something to do, know that somebody loves you, and something to look forward to. And the rest of it's superficial and really doesn't matter. So, everybody's going to look through a different lens at what it is to be mentally healthy. But for me, I think it's being able to manage without too much levels of ongoing distress to cope with the shit that life dishes out, and there's plenty of it.
Can I just jump in again? Because I think that's helped me answer my question about why I think they're not either end of a spectrum. And I think the problem with seeing mental illness as being one end of a spectrum is that when our mental health is not optimal, then I think people would then fear that means they're becoming mentally ill, but that's not the case all the time. So I think it's important for us to distinguish between the two and not see them as necessarily directly related to one another. Is that okay?
That's great. I did say that it was a doozy of a question that I'd been given, so I thought I would just throw it out there and see what.
I think you can define mental illness quite easily, because it's classified as a syndrome, a set of signs and symptoms of a criteria. When you look at mental health, it's different for every single person. And Jodie and I have played in the DSM and for many, many years and that, so we know what depression is, and we know what anxiety is, and we know what schizophrenia is, because it's there in black and white. However, there are many different layers to the spectrum of, well, what is distress? Because it's different for every single one of us. And when Jodie talks about the level of functioning, you look at, well, what is the level of distress that diminishes functioning? Then it becomes an issue, because it could be seen suffocating the person's potential.
And not all mental illnesses are the same either. They're all quite different and distinct from one another as well. So
definitely. No, that was great. So, John, you've obviously touched on in recent years, more professional sports people have been opening up about their own mental health struggles and issues. Do you think there's enough support for professional athletes, and what else should or could be provided in this area? So specifically for those more elite athletes, I guess?
I'll be a little bit contentious here. Why are we focusing on an elite athlete as opposed to somebody that plays in the Merivale Seconds?
That's a very good point.
Because their life is no more precious or no more different than the person that plays, Buddy Franklin, for example. So you're heading into dangerous waters here now, Marley, talking about elite sportsmen, because a life is a life, irrespective. It's the way the media portrays it or the community see it, because they define success as, say, I'll use Buddy Franklin as an example. So I think the difficulty we have now is we are, yes, very more skilled in treating when we know it's there. But I think if we're really going to stem the burden of disease, we have to start and work backwards in a preventative way and get the community, as Linda touched on before, the smaller footy clubs and all that, the community, the footy clubs are the hub of the community, or whatever sporting club it is. So that's where I see organisations like yourself really pushing back with a principle of getting the community to look after itself better, not relying on services to come in and fix the problem when it's already broken. Because I think we're closing the gate after the horse has bolted. And we can do that to a degree. What's recovery? It's different for every single person. So when you're talking about elite sportsmen, yes, they have sports psychologists in there, but I think an individual would say, well, I need more. Well, I'm sorry, there's a finite amount that we can throw at a given problem. So in order to really fix the problem, we've got to go back to the origins of why we had a problem in the first place.
Yeah, no, definitely. That actually leads in really well to my follow-on question. And you're right, it's not just about those professional athletes. It is everyone. And I suppose it does start with the grassroots clubs. And I guess my question is, how can clubs tackle the stigma that is mental health and embed a culture around talking about it, and that it is okay to talk about these things? John, you might be best to talk.
I was waiting for somebody else to come in. I had my rant then. Culture, to change a culture, you're looking at 10 plus years. So you have to start from somewhere. And as I said, back in the 90s, we did start to shift attitudes about mental illness and the suffering that goes. And I guess the pleasing thing from Linda and Jodie now, we see so many more people willing to talk now than what we've ever done before in our life. I go back to Jeff Kennett when he started Beyond Blue, and he focused and marketed, the symptoms of depression and now seek help. Then the last 3 or 4 years, he's launched into, this is Beyond Blue, with anxiety and stress-related disorders. The difficulty I have with that is when you market something, people will identify a need to access it. And my worry is, does the mental health service system have the resources to manage the demand? Which is why I keep going back to, if the community can empower itself a little bit more to manage itself, and yes, when there are serious cases of mental illness that require professional help, by all means, we should seek professional help when we need to. But I think there's more that we can do as a community, and breaking the stigma, and particularly with men's mental health. I think somebody said it earlier, big boys don't cry, man up, I suck it up and all that. Well, we're not back in the 30s and 40s anymore when life was so much simpler. It's very complicated now. I look at this, I'm looking at a rectangular piece of equipment talking to 4 faces. Who would have thought that 20 years ago?
The Jetsons. I think I have only one little thing to say about this, and it might be quite simplistic, but I think modelling, when we talk about nature and nurture, modelling is super important. And so I think there's a role from the top down in sporting organisations, from the coaching staff, the more senior players, if they can model what it means to express a normal human experience like feeling anxiety or low mood or choking when the pressure's too high in performance, and how they might struggle with whether it is a mental illness or not, or whether they struggle to stop dwelling on what just went wrong in that game, or how they actually formally engage in mindfulness practice as a part of their training regime, or just start to normalize some of being what it means to be human and be an athlete. I think that could go a really long way in contributing to changing or shifting a culture within a club or within a sport.
It's really a hard one, Jodie, because when you look at the media and the way it portrays, I'm going to use the AFL or the netball, there is such heavily weighted on performance, and the moment they slip up, the media are onto them. And so any wonder why, we've politicised everything, because we're not game to say exactly how we feel anymore, because the media are onto it. And unless you're aligned in a favourable way to the media, they cut you down and crucify you. And it's wrong, fundamentally wrong,
That's publicly though, but at a club level, I would think it's sort of like the cone of silence, just like, when you come and see someone like me. So, having, what gets said in the club rooms might, stay in the club rooms kind of thing.
I would hope so. Yeah.
I wondered about, when I read that question around how does a club tackle the stigma of mental illness, and a bit like what you've both been saying, and certainly Jodie around that modelling. And I think that often our environment, that you're talking about the media that's coming at us from all angles, if a club has got posters on the back of their club room doors around, hey, talk to us if they have, I don't know if they have meetings where they have, I'm sure HR, or not HR,
OH&S or something.
OH&S is on their agenda at their meeting, that they may put something like a mindfulness or a mental health wellbeing, starting the conversation and having signs up there, visible signs and verbal signs around that it's a normal conversation to have around how we're all doing. That mental wellbeing is as important to our club as our physical well-being, and it really does start at that sort of the top down and the bottom up. It just where the culture actually accepts this as normal. And whether they bring in a guest speaker, they might bring in you, Jodie, a guest speaker for one of their training nights. They might have some speakers or some community champions, all those sorts of things, and really take mental well-being as seriously as they do their physical well-being. It's easily done, really.
It's a funny thing I was thinking about tonight and the conversation, and about how endlessly an athlete will talk about their physical injury, and that it's planned around for training. Competition revolves around their recovery. They throw everything they've got at it. And talk about, the media, they're all over physical, injuries and who's out for how long. And the fact that people will rest when they have a physical injury and do what they need to recover. Wouldn't it be great if one day we wave a magic wand and we're at that place with our mental health and well-being as well?
Jodie, one of the tells for me around how people, I do believe that clubs and communities want this message. And I remember when Wayne Schloss brought the pucker up down to Warrnambool, I think through you guys, John, there were it was standing room only. There were over 400 people there listening to the story of what years ago would have been a bloke talking about falling down. And yet it was the story of resilience and mental issues and addictions and all the things that have been hidden. And he came to speak about it and came in droves. So the timing is really wonderful. If ever we've had a time in our lives for communities to come together and address these issues, we've just having a shared global experience, the time's really fertile now to start planting these mental well-being things into clubs, without a doubt.
Yeah, that's great, guys. This next question, I was thinking around, I'm very good friends with a few athletes that will play two sports. So they're part of the netball team and they're also part of the basketball team. They train twice a week for both sports and they play on the weekend for both sports. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you get a doubleheader in basketball and you're playing 3 lots of a high-level competitive sport. And I was thinking around, geez, that must be stressful and weigh heavy on someone, that feeling of, I need to do a good job for my team, and having that extra pressure of, well, it's not just one team that I need to do well for. It's multiple teams and it's happening in the same weekend. So, yeah, when do you think sport can become a stress on people's lives and their mental health and well-being?
I don't think you can generalise. I think it's very individual, Marley, because obviously those people have made choices, and some people are just driven like that. They just love it. Is their passion. And who's anybody to stand in the way of their passion at a time in their life? I guess that we've touched on about, well, when the sporting life finishes, where do they go then as far as having an individual identity in that? But, to be a brave person to try and stop them from doing something that they're obviously so passionate and love, purely love.
And that doesn't sound like any week I've ever had.
No, me either. Jodie,
I think that. I was just going to say, like with what John just said, I think that might be part of the answer, actually. When it stops being a passion, when it stops being fun or something that brings satisfaction or joy or pleasure or a sense of achievement with it, when it starts to feel like it comes at more of a cost than a benefit, when it starts to impede or impact. And this isn't to say, like, anyone who dedicates themselves to elite sport are obviously making a conscious sacrifice to other areas of their life, and that is a choice, and they might go into that knowingly for a period of time. But if it starts to impact negatively in other areas, important areas of their life, important to them, then, that might be another indication that this is no longer a good scenario for them. But I think anything that, dominates our thinking, anything that, becomes a little bit extreme or obsessive, can't be a good thing either.
Yeah. No, definitely. So over the past few years, our community has seen several suicides, and that's impacted quite heavily on local sporting clubs. How would clubs identify members that are experiencing mental health difficulties, and what role can sports clubs play in supporting members, not only members but their families that are impacted? John, maybe this might be a good question for you with Let's Talk.
I suppose one of the platforms, and Linda and Jodie are well aware that I'm very passionate about Let's Talk Foundation. Now, we've been going for 4 years now, and we really are starting to embed into this community and want to spread it out further. So one of the platforms of Let's Talk, obviously, we've talked about the stigma. The second one is getting people to seek help when they absolutely need to. The third platform is really about looking after each other, being more vigilant and noticing the characteristic changes in somebody. A farmer told me many years ago, that's the crook sheep over there, because it was out of the flock by itself, so it was alone. So I suppose that's where we're continuing to push the message for it. Don't be afraid to ask the question, I think one of the reasons why people historically have been afraid to ask the question, because they think, well, I have to know all the answers. I have to know how to respond. You know, one of the greatest treatments in managing mental illness is a therapeutic relationship, and will always be. So as Jodie and we've all touched on about, our sense of belonging and social connected is paramount to our existence. So I guess building off that, it is about being much more aware, vigilant of our friends, our family, our footy players, the netball players. And if you see subtle changes, you know, I've thought long and hard about this, you know, the Are You OK Day, a magnificent platform. All the clues are all there when you read all the literature, but it's not just about saying, are you okay? It is so much more to it than that. You might get a one-syllable response, but it's the way that you ask it that will actually probably lead to a more honest answer than just a shutdown. As we talk about effective communication, it's nearly all body language and your vocal inflection. So I think that's what we've been trying to do right across. And, you know, I encourage every organisation, every single person that cares about mental health to be ambassadors to those sorts of issues in getting people, you know, stop our language, psycho, loony, nutter. All those sorts of languages really just push people further away. So we need to, as Jodie's program, you know, don't judge somebody. You don't know their story. So give them the respect and present yourself in a caring, empathic way, and you are more likely to get an honest answer. If you don't get an honest answer, don't give up. Revisit it time and time again, particularly if you're noticing consistent changes in that person, which we all do. We've just got to stop looking through our own eyes and have a bit more peripheral vision if we really care about other people in our community.
John, I agree with everything you've said there, and if I Lifeline had a podcast that I listened to last year, and I don't remember the name of the athlete, I'm sorry, but he's an Indigenous rugby player, and he was speaking about his journey with depression and suicidality, and he said, it really struck me, he said so many times that people are struggling to reach out. There's help there to reach out. He said it's up to the community to notice a person struggling, for us to reach in. And that really struck a chord with me, that it's up to us to reach in, but as you say, people are worried about reaching in. They think they need to. And I've been speaking with the Sports Assembly around an online training that Living Works and Lifeline have around how to identify somebody who might be struggling and maybe talking about suicide, and actually giving them the skills in how to ask and how to get that person to help. So there's lots of things now. There's your program, John. There's Let's Talk. There's program Your Mates will come out to all sorts of areas like you will, and teach the community, give them the skills and the confidence to ask a person what they're struggling and how to get help.
I think that, and this is not at all to counter what John and Linda have said, but there are some circumstances where there are no signs. And so I think it's very important, you know, even as a trained healthcare professional, you know, psychologist, I could sit with a client who might be coming for completely different reasons. And if they do not want me to know that they are planning to end their life, I will not know. And in a sporting club, and often we hear of stories of where somebody has suicided and their family and their friends say they had no idea. So I think clubs, while they need to take action and they need to be proactive, I think they also need to be kind to themselves, that if something horrendous like that does happen, there may not have been the signs for them to pick up on, and they're not trained healthcare professionals. It's not their full responsibility to save somebody's life, although if they are in a position to help, then by all means they should. So I just think sometimes we have to, you know, not be too idealistic about what we can do if somebody actually makes up their mind to do that.
That's really well said, Jodie. Thank you. And it just has reminded me that it's probably a wonderful platform right now to let the community know that there is a support following suicide program across the district, so that if any families or friends or any people who have experienced the loss of someone, a friend or family, to suicide, that we do have a support following suicide program that can offer them supports and referrals to assistance. I think that's important for community to know as well.
Yeah, that's really great. And you have all answered my follow-up question, which was what support can be provided to sports clubs to assist with the support of their members and their families. So all of those links that you've spoken about, we will put at the end of this session for the community to be able to access really easily. Is there anything else?
I think sometimes the community is still not aware of what is available in terms of accessing psychological support or counselling. So their GP is always a really good first port of call, and they'll be really aware of the services that are available. There are some, run through private practitioners like myself, or through community counselling at Southwest Healthcare or the mental health service there. But there's also programs where there's no out-of-pocket expense and people have access up to 10 to 12 Medicare rebated sessions for a calendar year. So it's always worth a first conversation with the GP if you don't know where to start.
My next question, it touches on COVID-19 again, and it's around COVID-19 has meant we haven't been able to participate in our favourite physical activity pursuits in the way we have previously. However, we have seen an increase in the number of children and young people connecting with their families. Do you think that this isolation period will strengthen family bonds, and do you think we will see longer-term mental health benefits post-COVID-19 due to the increase of connectivity?
Yes, absolutely yes. I've heard so many reports. Yes, really alien, really odd in the early days, because families hadn't actually sat in the lounge room together. Families hadn't actually had a meal together, couldn't remember. So pretty strange at the start, but a lot of comments coming now about the benefits of actually really getting to know the family so much more and talking so much more around the table, dealing with the challenges of online education and, mum and dad working from home and all this sort of, a horrendous change. But given that it's been going on for quite a while, I think the adjustment and this is only anecdotal from what I've heard through stories and that, there have been a lot of positives about this.
I agree, John, and I hate to ever take a positive away and say something negative, but I did want to just put this in because I like the positive spin all the time. But I think that we have to also really take into account that some families are not safe environments, and we've seen domestic and family violence where children are not in safe environments. So alongside those fantastic stories that I've heard as well, and I agree with you 100%, I think we also have to be aware that for some kids coming out of COVID, it may not be the wonderful family connective experience. We just have to be on guard for those sorts of traumas to also come out. And again, I hate to be negative, but it's kind of factual as well.
No, it's realistic, Linda. No, thank you.
You beat me to it.
God, you're a couple of mozzes.
Sorry, Joe.
We're seeing a lot of, we will be seeing, I'm sure, a lot of our students who have anxiety disorders or are more prone to anxiety, a lot of our students on the autism spectrum, they're going to be a lot of people that actually really thrived in virtual learning and working from home, who might struggle to come back out into real life. But my sincerest hope for all of us is that we have really clocked onto what it meant to slow down and the benefits for our own health and well-being, but also our environment, I don't know, every aspect of life, I think, and that we really fight to take some of those benefits back into everyday life and not just get sucked straight back into the busyness that we seem to wear as a bit of a badge of honour most of the time, because it just isn't good for us. We can't sustain it, I think. And if anything, this little break has shown us that. So it's been
I'll second that, Jodie.
yeah.
It's interesting you say that, Jodie, because a lot of people have been saying, when things get back to normal. But equally, there's a lot of it, well, I don't want it to go back to the way it was.
Exactly. Let's create the new normal the way we want to.
You guys keep just leading into my questions. It's really great. Obviously, you've spoken about the positives and that. Do you think we'll see a prolonged mental health issue beyond the return of this new norm as we're going to see it?
You're talking about something, Marley, that has so many different layers to it. And you're not going to summarise it in 2 minutes or things like that, because we've all got different opinions about the same topic because we all look through a slightly different lens. Life is an adjustment. This has been adjustment, and how much we adjust back to the way it was and how much is under our control, what we have a say in, is really, unknown territory at the moment. We've been at the mercy of Daniel Andrews and the rules for the last, number of weeks. So whether he's done a good job or a bad job, who would know? But I think our mental health will experience a bit of a spike over the next goodness knows how long. If you look at the economy, how much money they've had to go on into that? Well, somebody's going to have to pay for that at some stage. So, are we living beyond our means? There's so many different economic reasons to it. Emotionally, it is the unknown water, which I think comes with stress for vulnerable people, because essentially we're in uncharted waters at the moment.
That's for sure.
We have obviously seen with COVID just how great technology has been, and we're so well connected with technology now. But I was reading a study that showed that 1 in 2 young Victorians reported feeling alone either sometimes or always in a time where we can't physically connect. Obviously now where the rules are easing a little bit and we're allowed to, but when restrictions were in place and we couldn't physically connect, what would your advice to sports clubs be to support the younger members in their club? I know that's been a real talking point with clubs is how they support their younger members, because they're the ones that I suppose have got all the questions and are asking, when can we come back?
My initial reaction would be, if when we were sort of restricted to one-on-one kind of exercise outings, would there be a way of setting up like a mentor kind of relationship, whether that's with an older player and a younger player, or I don't know, something like that, where there was that physical contact, because we're lucky in Victoria we could have that still one-on-one, and now we can have obviously more people in our homes, and we can train in larger groups outside and so on. So I think, I guess I'm saying making the most of a bad situation with what you can. I hear a lot of the time the young people that I work with feel excluded. There'll be things happening on social media, or there'll be even chats like this, and they won't have been invited, and they feel excluded from that. So making a conscious effort, I guess I said, making the best of a bad situation. So if it is going to be technology based, making sure that they are engaged and included, that could go a really long way. And again, technology might not work for everybody. A lot of kids don't like to use the phone to talk, or they don't like to look through a camera. And I think again about my anxious kids or the kids on the autism spectrum, it's just not going to work for them. So figuring out other ways, and could that be email, or could that be, a front yard visit, or I don't know, just thinking outside the square, and that not everyone fits the same mold when it comes to communication styles. So, and we should at the very least know the personalities of our players and the people that make up our club. So working with that.
Very final question is, for someone who's been experiencing or affected by mental illness, how important is it for them to re-engage in sport and recreation activities that they may have previously been involved in? And what sort of support is available to assist them do so?
So this leads in magnificent, because I've talked to a lot of people, like I'm sure Linda and Jodie have as well. Coming back to the club is one of the greatest therapeutic medications anybody can do. Initially there's anxiety, there's apprehension. Will I be accepted? Will I be shunned over in the corner? But every story I've ever heard was they are totally embraced back into the club. And that's, as I probably would all agree, it's probably as good as any medication they can have, because as we continually say through this whole session, it is about social inclusion. It is about a sense of belonging and feeling cared for. So every club has the responsibility, if they're going to be serious about their flock, to include them back in as soon as possible. And even when they're going through their difficult times, keep connected with them.
I certainly think that, yes, re-engage. I think people will be to re-engage. And I did have a thought about you hear so many people are so excited about the restrictions being dropped a little. But one of the biggest things that has been roaming around in my head for the last few days thinking about this webinar has been that every club, its supporters are one-eyed and all that sort of stuff, which is wonderful. And we live in an individualist society. So we're all, if I'm a tiger through and through. But one of the things that we've experienced as not only a global community, but certainly everybody in this country, we've all experienced something that is the same, possibly for the first time in human history. And one of the things that I was thinking about for clubs is that connecting to other clubs on a social or I'm not quite sure where my mind's going, but you're still going to obviously be the biggest fan of your own club. Just spreading our tentacles out a little bit and getting to know the community of who our clubs are and know the other players and kind of get connection with each club, which possibly you do anyway at the sports assembly, or might be the old name for it. But I did think it's a great opportunity for clubs to really reach out to other clubs. Fundamentally, the sport is the sport, and each club have their own, I'm going to be rambling here, but their own little satellites. But what a great time to be able to really connect with the other clubs in the area in some way, but in a really positive manner. I just don't.
No, definitely.
I've got a million ideas, but we haven't got time.
No, wouldn't it be fair to say, Marley, that actually happens? Like after post-game and that, there is a social event after every single game. So in part, I think we're already doing and have been historically doing that since as long as I can remember, the social component of the sport.
Yeah.
And when you live in this community for that long and you play an individual sport, it opens up your social network absolutely profound, and that carries you for the rest of your life.
Yeah. Definitely agree with that. Jodie, did you have anything?
Well, I think that's a wonderful idea. I think we need to just, as human beings in general, shift that spotlight of our attention more onto the things that we have in common and away from our differences. And Linda, that's such a beautiful idea, because we have all, as a world, just experienced this together. So I think that's an awesome idea. The only other thing I'm thinking is that, for the people that are struggling to come back because it's anxiety provoking or because they've been so distressed or whatever it might be, sometimes it's a matter of the best thing you can do is the thing that you don't feel like doing. And so re-engaging with your sporting club, there's no argument from any of us that that's one of the best things you could possibly do for your own health and well-being. But if you're not quite motivated or there to do that, perhaps just set yourself a couple of week goal and just start going through the motions. And I promise you, things are never as bad in reality as it is up here. And when you start going through the motions, your brain will quickly realize that none of your worst fears are coming true. And in actual fact, because of all that brain chemistry stuff we talked about before, you're going to feel much better very quickly. And then the rest will be history.
And Jodie, going back to earlier what you said about that coach making those individual phone calls, and if the clubs know their people, actually when you're asking what support the clubs can offer people, pick up the phone and welcome them back. Actually say, hey, I'm really looking forward to seeing you on Wednesday night. We can't wait to be together again. Actually making it that the club can take on a bit of responsibility to say, let's give everyone a buzz and look forward to catching up. So there's all sorts of ways that the club can support, and I don't know what other supports are available to clubs, but that's your job, Marley.
I want to say thank you so much for giving up your time tonight. I really appreciate it, and hopefully post-COVID we can do something a little bit more formal with clubs with you guys. We understand mental health is a sensitive subject amongst a lot of people, but it doesn't need to be. We need to talk about it more and get rid of the stigma. I'd like to leave you now with a quote from Kevin Love of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Mental health isn't just an athlete thing. What you do for a living doesn't have to define who you are. This is an everyone thing.